Welcome back to Getting In, a College Coach Conversation. We just talked about bonding with your pre-med advisor when you get to college. And now we're going to be talking about you, where we're going to answer your questions. But before I get to your questions, or we get to your questions, and actually I should introduce Shannon Vasconcelos, who is my colleague, also a former financial aid officer at BU and Tufts. And just also happens to be a major media star these days, having recently appeared on Good Morning America and the Today Show. So if you're interested, you could check that out and see those clips. They should be posted on our website, getintocollege.com. But believe it or not, back in February, we celebrated 5 years of this weekly podcast being on the air. And we are about to record shortly, in a couple of weeks, our 300th episode. And I should have come up with some interesting items of 300, but suffice to say, we're pretty impressed with ourselves. We've done 300 of these, and I hope that you have found that they've been really helpful to you. We actually got support from a listener the other day who said she was removing us from her podcast list. But before we assumed that that was a bad thing, it was because we had been super helpful as her daughter was applying to college. She listened religiously for 2 years, got a lot of really good advice that ended up with some really great results for her daughter, which was very exciting. So we are certainly sad to see her go, but hoping that there will be a whole bunch of new people who start listening as a result. So thank you. So here is a celebration. I'm going to read it so that I don't get it wrong, but we're going to have another contest for our listeners. Between now and October 20th, if you go and rate us on Apple Podcasts, you're going to be entered in a raffle to win 2 free hours of either college counseling on the admission side or the college finance side. So you might be able to chat with Shannon, who generally only talks to the hosts of places like Good Morning America and the Today Show. And actually, I'm kidding. She talks to lots of people all the time about this very thing. Or an admissions person, probably one of the hosts, could be me, could be Ian, could be Sally. And so all you need to do is leave a rating and maybe a couple of kind words and you'll be entered. So we're going to randomly select a name and announce that on our October 29th episode. So I guess between now and October 29th, you need to put that in. Okay, Shannon, hi. We have questions and we want to get to them. So
Definitely.
You have one for me.
I sure do. Yes, okay. This is from Christine, and it came in on our Facebook page. So, folks, if you do have questions, feel free to leave a comment or message us on Facebook, and we will try to get to them in an upcoming show. But Christine asks, running into a problem here where we would like to get November 1st due date early action apps in sooner via the Common App. But you have only 2 choices, test submission or none. My son has an in-school test scheduled for early October, but lately the ACT results are running later than 3 weeks, and of course it might ultimately get canceled. Some schools say in their policy or on the app that once you pick test optional, they will not accept a late test score. Most don't say anything about late additions. One of the schools says they haven't decided yet if they will go test optional for merit aid. Seems unreasonable under these circumstances. What is your advice? All of this seems like the schools may be a bit out of touch with 2020's struggles.
Yes. Well, Christine, I do not disagree with that there are schools that seem a little out of touch. You know, not to be apologetic, because I do think schools that haven't gone test optional, I don't think that's a good look. I don't think it's good for them. I also will say that not all schools, it's not under their control necessarily. So in the state of Florida, the Florida University Systems Board of Governors voted to still require testing. And so if you are working for the university, your hands are tied. So the admissions offices may have really wanted to be test optional, and then the Board of Governors said, nope, we're going to require. I'm going to wade out of the political quagmire that is likely to be involved here and address more of your question. For starters, there's something really key that you said at the beginning of your question, which is that you would like to get November 1st due date early action apps in sooner. And what I will say is that that is not necessary. And in this situation is probably not something I would advise. I do think it's good to be pressing submit for a November 1 admission date sooner than the day of November 1. So a couple of days in advance in case there are any sort of technical glitches, I think is a good idea. But the idea that you would need to, and I think you sent this in August, that it would need to go in September or, you know, this month or even early October is, I wouldn't do it. I don't think it's necessary. And like I said, I would advise against it this year for the reason that you're mentioning. What if you know in advance that his October test date is canceled? Well, now you know, okay, great, submit away. He's going to be test optional because he's not going to have the opportunity to take the test. The other bad news that I have for you is that, well, not that that's bad news about not submitting early, but what I would say is that you probably want to place a call to each of these schools, especially if they're not clear. There definitely are some schools that have basically said either you are test optional or you're not test optional. So if you want the ability to see the score before you decide, which by the way, I would encourage you to take, I think that's the smart path, then I would hold off on sending that application to the schools that make you choose one way or the other until the last minute. And then I would also put a call into each of the schools. Presumably he's hopefully applying to a reasonable list of schools, maybe 8 to 12 schools at the most. And in which case he could call, or you, mom, could call and just get some clarification. What are their rules? Because they may say, oh, it's fine. If he's able to test in October, great. Then we'll expect to see test scores. And, you know, when you get him, send him along. And if he's not able to test, then I guess he'll go test optional. Or you could submit as test optional and then change the status. Because it's done differently at every school, I really do feel in this case like you're probably going to have to make a call to every school unless it's very, very clearly laid out on their websites.
Yep. Makes sense.
Okay. Shannon, I have one for you. And this comes to us from Dorsey. Also, well, this is via our website, actually. And the question asks, will the pension contributions required by my employer be added to our adjusted family income and used in the FAFSA or CSS profile? I will not have the ability to access any of the pension contributions as income until my youngest is almost finished with college. Thank you.
So short and sweet answer is yes. You will have to report those pension contributions, or for folks who have 401ks, 403bs, all of those kinds of contributions to employer-sponsored retirement plans. You do have to report on the FAFSA and the profile. They will ask you for those. And it's essentially the reasoning behind it is they are part of your income, and you may choose to contribute part of that income to a retirement plan, or in Dorsey's case, required to contribute part of that income to their retirement plan. In any and all cases, it's still considered part of your income. So you will see a question about those contributions to retirement plans or pension plans on both the FAFSA and the profile, and whether or not you have access to it immediately, they still want it reported. And that's kind of pretty much across the board. We also see it in cases where students are beneficiaries of trust funds and they don't get access to the trust fund until maybe age 30. They still have to report those trust funds as an asset, which often families don't like that. But if you ask a financial aid office, they will say that, you know, eventually you will get access to that money, and that does put you in a better position than somebody else who will never have access to such money. So a few years down the line, you can get access to those pension contributions, and theoretically you could borrow student loans to pay for college and then later pay them back with that money that you contributed to your pension. So that's the longer answer. Short and sweet answer is yes, you have to report them, and there will be instructions on the FAFSA directing you where to find the exact numbers you need to report, likely looking at box 12 on your W-2 form. There are various codes you might find there, but it does spell it out pretty clearly on the FAFSA form as well as the profile. But short and sweet is yes, you do have to report them.
All right.
Okay, and the next admissions question came in from Michelle, also on our website, so you can submit questions there as well, folks. Getintocollege.com. If my ACT composite score is slightly above the college's average, but my math score is less than their average, and I'm applying as a business major. Should I submit my ACT score? The colleges I'm applying to have a 45% acceptance rate. Thank you.
Tricky question,
Yeah.
Michelle. So on the one hand, if the composite is above the college's average, so here's what I'm not sure. Is it above their, is it totally above the middle 50%? So the middle 50% have a 28 to a 32, and the composite you have is a 33. Okay, that's interesting. If the math score is less than their average, but I'm sorry, if really their middle 50% is a 28 to a 32 and you have a 31, it's above the midpoint of the middle 50%. It's still in the middle 50%. It's a little tricky without the exact numbers in front of me. But I would say in general, our advice is usually if you are in the upper half of the middle 50% or higher, it's not a bad thing to submit your score. What makes it a little tricky is you're applying as a business major. Sometimes, although not always, sometimes the business programs are more selective than the school as a whole. So while the school as a whole may be admitting 45% of their applicant pool, it's possible that business is more like 30% or 25% or possibly less, depending on the size of the program. So in that case, it may not be in your best interest to submit that test score because they're going to be paying very close attention to your math performance. So here is another wrinkle that I would say. If you are a stellar math student, if you have taken calculus, if you have traditionally always done well in math and your grades in math are very strong, if you have an AP score in math, for example, that you could report on your application, that's great, which I would identify that as a 4 or a 5. So if you maybe took a subject test, I mean, I don't know who was able to take subject tests this year, but let's just say for argument's sake, you were able to take a subject test and you had a good score in that, then I would be a whole lot less concerned about a sub-score on the ACT. But if traditionally math is not your best subject, if you already are kind of barely hanging on to a low A, B, high B, or even a regular B, and then your testing in that area is low, there might be an argument that you wouldn't submit. But here's what I'm going to suggest that you do. I'm going to suggest that you actually call every school and ask. They're not going to record it and say, ooh, this student called and this is what she has on her test and her math score is low, and put it in the file. That is not going to happen. What they are generally going to be willing to do is give you some advice. Here's my score. Here's the composite. Here's the math score. I'm applying to business. What do you think? And they can give you an opinion. And I would take them at their word. They're not trying to trick you. They're generally going to be pretty straightforward with you. Again, tricky there really isn't a straightforward answer on this one, but I do think that if you can kind of evaluate your performance in math in general and make the call that way, but you also probably not a bad idea to call the school directly.
Yeah.
So.
So many variables. This is why we stay employed, I guess.
It is exactly
These questions are not easy.
All right, Shannon, I have one more for you before we go to the break. And this comes to us from Maria, who says, my oldest child graduated college in May. When do they need to start paying back their student loans? Question.
Yeah, so under normal circumstances, if you graduate in May, with most student loans, certainly the government direct Stafford loan program, which is what most people are borrowing from that program, you have a 6-month grace period. You would enter repayment in November, 6 months from whatever your grad date was. We're living in a funky year, of course, in more ways than one, in a lot of ways. But this year, it will not be until, assuming we're talking about federal student loans, it will not be till after the new year. The CARES Act that Congress passed in the spring gave every student loan borrower a forbearance on their loan, so they don't have to make any payments, and nor do the loans accrue any interest. So you can take that forbearance without it hurting you at all. You're not accruing any interest at all. The initial CARES Act granted that forbearance until the end of September, and then President Trump just signed an executive order which extended that interest-free forbearance until the end of the year, until December 31st. So nobody has to make any payments on any student loans until after December 31st as it currently stands. We don't know if there'll be more legislative action that could possibly extend things. But as of right now, it's after December 31st, you'll have payments start coming due. If your child is unemployed and may find difficulty, it may be difficult to make payments still at that point, because of course it's not a great job market right now. You can always, we were all granted a forbearance kind of automatically until December 31st, but you can always request a deferment on your student loans. It's called economic hardship deferment if you're unemployed, or there are other types of forbearances. So talk to your student loan servicer if you're not able to make payments after December 31st. If you are able to make payments, you can, even though everyone's been granted a forbearance, you can voluntarily make payments right now. So if your child is employed and perfectly able to make payments, you can do that right now if you want to. You just have to, again, reach out to your loan servicer.
Right. And if you can make payments, why wouldn't you right now, right? So
do it up. And I would say the only caveat to that and why some people might not want to is if there are other things, because those loans aren't accruing interest. If you have like credit card debt that is accruing interest, maybe take all that extra money, stick it towards the credit card or building up an emergency fund. There could be other things to do with it, but yeah, if you don't have any other debt that's costing you money, yeah, just get rid of those student loans.
Start getting rid of it. Exactly. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. We are going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're getting back to your questions. So don't go away.